let's cue the music and start that word chat.
Hello, everybody. Welcome again to That Word Chat. It's so great to have you here on this beautiful sunny day where I am and presumably where our guest, Roy Peter Clark, is. Last time we had Roy on the show 3 years ago. It's amazing that it's been 3 years. It was a little bit earlier in March, and so it was much sunnier and nicer there than it was here in Columbus. But Roy has a new book out. Is Tell It Like It Is, a guide to clear and honest writing. There we go. And it's actually due out, I think, next week. But they sent me a copy, with no index and no numbers on the contents page to take a look at. So, Roy, great to have you back again. How's everything with you?
Mark, thanks for your hospitality, for bringing me back, and for all you guys do for people of the word.
I like that. Thank you very much. That's very kind. So I want to jump right in and start. Let's start with the beginning of the book. The preface of the book says, "The darker and more dystopian the future appears, the more influential public writers become." And you're normally a cheery guy. And when I read that, I thought we start out the first couple of words are darker and more dystopian. So, are we living in dark times?
Well, whenever I'm tempted to answer yes to that question, I kind of think of a lesson that I learned in college at Providence College in Rhode Island, small liberal arts college. And my teachers told me, beware of the myth of the golden age. Okay? And the myth of the golden age in literature suggests this pastoral time in the past in human history. The Garden of Eden is the myth of the golden age. That there was a time when, and we have lost that. For those who will be listening to this maybe in the future, I think it's a coincidence that we're having this conversation on a day when the first former president of the United States is being indicted for multiple felony crimes. And he is messaging out what a terrible day this is. And he ends his message with is it an acronym? Yeah, MAGA, M-A-G-A, which stands for what? Make America Great Again, with his version of the golden age, the myth of the golden age. I was 20 years old and in college in 1968. And I remember well the assassination of Dr. King, the assassination of Robert Kennedy, police riots on the streets of Chicago during the Democratic National Convention, the Soviet Union invading Czechoslovakia, riots on the streets of Paris. And so, how shall I say it? It's and then after that, the shooting, the murder of 4 students at Kent State University. It seemed as if that was the darkest of times. So I think my resolution is that when it seems that way, when there are more and more zombie movies coming out, I think it's a signal to public writers and people of goodwill to get back to work. And that's why I wrote Tell It Like It Is, named after the beautiful Aaron Neville ballad. It's my 20th book. I was totally ready to stop at 19. But at the time we talked 3 years ago, you know, we could feel that something different was happening. And it seems to me that, you know, it meant that public writers had to gear up again to serve the public interest. I use the phrase public writers because I don't want to limit this to journalists, professional nonfiction writers. We need them. I guess the phrase is they're necessary but insufficient. And look what's happened. How many people writing about the pandemic, for example, have come from different disciplines, from the business world, from the government world, all aspects of medical science. And yeah, we need to try to figure out, as citizens, we need to figure out what to do, especially in an emergency. Oh my God, a bank just closed in Silicon Valley. What does it mean? Where should we go to? And that effort, how shall I say, that effort supersedes, or that effort neutralizes the poison of pessimism.
So is writing? Writing is. I mean, you could say writing is a public service. In general, good writing, thoughtful writing, where we're sharing a message. What distinguishes the being a public writer and I mean, you said it's I think journalism is at a base, but it goes beyond journalism. And what does it have to be nonfiction? Maybe could you define a little bit better what a public writer is?
I think it might be easier to begin with maybe my notion of what a public writer is not.
Okay.
And so I could read, and I have tried to read, many texts about the pandemic. Many written by scientists, and many written in scientific journals, refereed scientific journals. And many of them I cannot understand. They weren't written for me.
Mm-hmm.
They were written for other scientists, other epidemiologists. Now, I don't criticize that as jargon, you know, which sometimes too often in the past, maybe I have used the word jargon in the pejorative. If writers, scientists who write for other scientists are not necessarily public writers. Dr. Fauci, just to name probably the most prominent, is an epidemiologist of long standing, and someone who, back from the AIDS epidemic, has been an important character in the battle against certain diseases. Yeah, he's bilingual, which is to say that he can read those journals written by other scientists like Rick can, but he can translate that knowledge and translate that data. I only single him out because he's so prominent. There are some scientists who have the ability to do that, to express themselves publicly, and some scientists who either can't or unwilling to translate scientific knowledge into common language, because somehow they feel that they're being untrue to the science, or that they're dumbing it down. And what I'm saying is that arguing this book, and I'm following in the footsteps of many other writers and critics, is that plain language is the tool, and civic clarity is the result.
Civic clarity.
Civic clarity. When we talk about good writing, this is when I got into the business of being a newspaper coach. When people talked about great writing, they often talked about, almost all the time, they talked about the examples that were dragged out were serial narratives. Right? They were essentially nonfiction novels. Black Hawk Down, just to name one that comes to mind. In St. Pete, where I'm from, the St. Pete Times had writers like Tom French and Ann Hull and others who were telling amazing stories in the public interest. And it was at a time when, in the 80s and 90s, when newspapers were well resourced and where you could take time to do those kinds of things. But somebody asked me one day, you know, I don't get a chance to spend a year at a high school covering, you know, the state of education. I'm covering city halls. City Hall. I'm covering public utilities. I write about zoning. How do I make that clear and interesting? And that was a challenge that I recognized right away was authentic and legitimate. And in newspapers, we still call many things stories that are actually reports. And so the distinction is very clear in my mind. Now, took some time. And that is that for the kind of writing that we do, there's civic clarity on one end of the spectrum, and on the other end of the spectrum, there's, let's call it narrative power, literary power. Okay, that's the distinction. The most important distinction is between a report and a story. A report has as its central purpose the transmitting of information. What does that mean? Well, it means that, yeah, if you're 65 or older, Roy, you'll be able to get COVID vaccines, finally. But here's what you have to do, and here's where you have to go to get them. Right? Now, that's one kind of report. I'm going to point you there. Now, if I were to go to that place, say St. Leo's College, about an hour's drive from here, and have to wait on a line, as some people did, not there, other places, what was it like for old people sitting in their car for 6 hours waiting to get vaccinated? that doesn't require a report. That requires what I call a story. And the purpose of that story is not the rendering of information. It is the rendering vicariously of experience. It's not pointing you there, it's putting you there. It's telling you what it was like. Now, the way to actualize, to realize that distinction, to put it into practice, is on one side of the equation to list the traditional reporting questions: who, what, where, when, why, and how. And those are still windows to information. But they still exist on the story side, but they have to be translated. They have to be, I want to say, maybe thought out. Not thought out, but like unfrozen. So that who exists in stories, but we change the name. We call it a character. And a character is realized by the rendering of details. By my looking over your shoulder, Mark, and trying to figure out whose bust that is over your head. And why you have, who is that? Is that Virgil, or who is that?
Well, there's sort of a long story behind it.
Well, all right, let me finish this thought, and then we'll
go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah.
But the idea is that if I'm writing about you, you're not just a name, you're a character if you're in a story. Who becomes character? What becomes action delivered in scenes? Where, we have a word for the where, we call it the setting. The when turns into a chronology, time in action. We know sadly from mass shootings that the hardest thing for the journalist is the why. Because in stories it's motive. If you're writing fiction, it's easier to do it. Shakespeare often made the motive opaque. It became a more interesting story. And even the how, if you turn the how into how it happened, it leads to a sort of a retelling in a kind of a narrative form. These modes can be mixed for various purposes, but my book deals with both of them, but especially the first 24 chapters are how to make something clear, how to achieve civic clarity in the public interest.
Okay.
If I just want to say this now,
yeah.
Before you tell the story, I want to say, I don't know if you can see it. I'm going to grab. So you have this character over your head, and I have this character over my head,
Yes.
from Baby Yoda from The Mandalorian. So this says something about my character. That bust is something about your character.
Well, I do have a little Han Solo
Oh,
on my shelf as well. So so there is a tie in there. Yes, so when I have more questions on public writing.
okay.
But this is the reason I say it's a story is because I just had to move this. This was sitting down here in the middle of this shelf, but I got one more book by Roy Peter Clark, C, and so that threw off so I originally had all my Clarks down here on the next shelf, but then I thought, no, I've got you can't see at the bottom. It's kind of still a mess when we get down to, I still got a shelf beyond Zinsser, but that's sort of
Mark,
different types of writing books.
One of my favorite types of photographs is the shelfie.
Yeah, I know. And and you're prominent on my shelfie right here. So the reason this exists, the reason this was here, is because the very first episode of that word chat was Mary Norris,
Mhm.
who had just written the book Greek to Me, and then she was going to come to town. Then the pandemic hit,
Yeah.
and she couldn't come to Bexley, where I live, to do a talk at the bookstore. So instead, we started this Zoom show, and you were the third guest. We did it once a week, and you were week 3. But I just moved this. This is Marathon Boy. This is a statue that was found, a full statue in 1925. It was found in the water off Marathon and brought up. So they, discovered
Uh,
this old.
is it the messenger?
Well, no, it just happened to be in Marathon. So it was really just, we don't know who.
Let's make believe that it's the messenger.
We could tell a story about it. Yeah. Yes, the messenger who ran the marathon himself, and it could be, Anyway, so that's a story, and it's interesting. I mean, you tell, you talk about this in that the story is the information, but then there's also the nuggets of interesting stuff that helps move the narrative, and maybe that's an example.
Yeah. Look, we learn these strategies from each other. Mark Kramer, when I was describing the mixing of modes of both reported elements and story elements,
Mhm.
he said, "Oh, you mean the broken line?" And I said, "Oh, do I?" And he said, "Yes." He said, and he referred to books where actually I was reading a book called Radical, which is a social history of breast cancer in America, and written by an author who is had breast cancer and has been receiving treatment for it for a number of years. And what's interesting about the book is that it begins with a personal narrative. There are chapters that are personal and they're stories. But then it kind of moves, when it gets to a social history, there's more reported elements in it. Why West Coast oncologists think differently than East Coast oncologists. Now this is a form, a story form that I think is not exotic. A newspaper story, a Wall Street Journal story begins with an anecdote, let's say, about the popularity of spam that canned meat. And what follows is a section. It begins with an anecdote about a World War II soldier making himself a spam sandwich because in the war, that's what you ate over in Europe, the K rations. And then it moves to the business of spam, and back and forth and back and forth. And those are, I think of it as a train on a track. And you begin in motion, let's say, with a story. But then every once in a while you stop and you explain what the story is about. One of the names for that, right, is the nut paragraph does that very often. It's usually in the third or fourth paragraph in a story that's attempting to explain something. So I think it's also, how shall I say this? It's important to remember like why we have reports and why we have stories. So a woman scholar named Louise Rosenblatt, wonderful, wonderful thinker and writer about how readers read stories. And she makes in her own way this distinction. And she uses as her example the message on the back of a bottle of poison. There's a bottle of poison and someone ingests it by mistake. and realizes it, and you turn over to the back of the bottle and see the skull and crossbones or whatever, you want to know in a text what you need to do right now because your life is at stake. The point she makes is that at that point, no one has any time for metaphors or similes. That you need a kind of directness of language that leads you, that is clear and leads you to action, right? And in a way, I think readers, I don't know if you felt this way, Mark, but I think readers may be surprised by my first example of sort of public writing, civic clarity in the public interest. And it has something to do with my wife kind of coming down with a cold and during the pandemic, and we were wondering whether we should take a COVID test. So we had a couple in the house. We hadn't taken the test before. So I helped her take the test. I opened the box, took out the materials, and took out a big folded paper. And that had been created in English on one side and Spanish on the other side. And we went through the 9 steps. And the test was negative, happy to say. And I started to go back and to read the directions again. And she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Whoever wrote this did a really good job." I mean, how shall I say this? Talk about high stakes writing in the public interest. What could be higher than the job of crafting something in words and images using lots of white space and numbers on the steps you need to take to see if you have this illness. So yeah, no one, that's not going to win any contests. But in a way, it stands with many other important texts that I can think of that have been created during the last 3 years.
And it's not just, it doesn't have to be the level of importance to be in a national newspaper or even something of that level of importance. I mean, I think that what you're talking about is applicable to the many communications that happen every day where people don't understand each other because
Yes,
you know,
or yeah. It occurs to me that I might read something, a quick example from the book.
Sure.
And I have a copy of the book that has an index.
Oh.
All right. And so this is early on, page 26. So, okay, here we go.
Mhm.
So I'm talking about clarity in civic writing and communication, how it's created. It says, let's see how this strategy applies to coverage of a public health crisis. I found this brief description at CNN.com. Okay, so here we go, something about COVID early on an important news site. The coronavirus is actually not one type of virus. It is a large family of viruses that also includes SARS and other minor to major respiratory illnesses. Coronaviruses can be spread between animals and people, as we have seen with the current strain. The term Corona, which is from the Latin root meaning crown or ring of light, refers to the shape of the virus under a microscope. Okay? Well, here's what I say about that text. This feels like the right pace for helping readers learn. No need to resort to Dick and Jane type sentences. Let's count the number of words in each of the three sentences. 27, 16, 25. The pace is fairly easy, and the variation of sentence length gives the reader an agreeable rhythm. Okay, now I want to turn, before I read my suggested translation of that passage, to a strategy that was taught to me by, in my mind, one of the greatest writing teachers in American history, Donald Murray from the University of New Hampshire and the Boston Globe. So many of my books, like Writing Tools and others, Writing Tools is dedicated to Don Murray. And Murrayisms, his sayings, you can find them everywhere. My job is really, I want to be original when I can, but also I want to pass these things on to another generation. And he says, you know, too often, newspaper writers, for example, even for places like the Washington Post and the New York Times, will get a complicated topic and they'll get all the material and it's correct and it's accurate. But when it comes to like writing a lead, they'll stuff what they got into like one sentence or one paragraph. And they'll write these suitcase leads. You know, the stuff doesn't fit, so they sit on the suitcase and they squeeze it in there. And he says, people are not going to learn from that. What they're going to learn from shorter words, shorter sentences, shorter paragraphs at the points of greatest complexity. Okay, so I had that tool was in my toolbox when I tried to rewrite it. That said, consider the effect of slowing down the pace even more. All right, here we go. And I'm going to read in the punctuation so you can hear. The coronavirus is actually not one type of virus, period. It is a large family of viruses, period. That family includes SARS and other minor to major respiratory illnesses, ones that affect your breathing, period. Coronaviruses can be spread between animals and people, period. That's what may have happened with the current strain, period. The term corona comes from a Latin root meaning crown or ring of light, period. It refers to the shape of the virus under the microscope, period. Okay, and then I write, you can decide if that's clearer. The word count is, remember the original word count was 27, 16, 25. Now we are 9, 7, 16, 8, 7, 14, 11. I've revised 3 sentences into 7. Perhaps defining respiratory illnesses is a step too far. Reading the 2 passages again, I believe that mine is a little more comprehensible. There's still variety in length, but with a slower pace. And the slower pace is created by those 7 periods, those 7 stop signs, what the Brits call appropriately the full stop. Okay? God, this stuff is hard to write. What am I going to do? How am I going to do it? Shorter words, shorter sentences, shorter paragraphs at the points of greatest complexity. When I find myself writing the sentence, here's how it works. It's like a switch or a gear shift that leads me to a voice that's going to take responsibility for what readers know and understand. I hope I'm being clear.
You are being very clear. and that's the whole point. I will point out that your first period came at the expense of a semicolon.
Yeah.
So are you pro semicolon or anti semicolon?
Well, let me bring you to a chapter in the book, and we'll see. I think it's chapter 48. All right, here we go. Ed Young won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage in the Atlantic, I believe, for, quote, the story How the Pandemic Defeated America. And there's actually a sentence about Trump. It's actually 212 words. I'll read a little bit of it. You won't find a more negative take on the former president than this one. No one should be shocked that a liar who has made almost 20,000 false or misleading statements, misleading claims during his pregnancy, would lie about whether the U.S. had the pandemic under control, semicolon. That a racist who gave birth to the birtherism would do so little to stop a virus that was disproportionately killing black people, semicolon, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a single sentence of 212 words. No journalism text I know of would recommend such a length, but Young makes it work with a little help from his language friends. They are placement of the subject and verb, the word that used as a subordinate conjunction, and of course, the semicolon. Not just one semicolon, mind you, but 8 in one sentence. In my book, The Glamour of Grammar, I described the semicolon as a swinging gate. And that really helps me, right? Not a locked gate, but the swinging gate. And
there it is.
My favorite title, The Glamour of Grammar. But the idea is that it creates a separation between two phrases or elements in a sentence. But you don't have to unlock anything. You just swing the gate open and it creates a connection. I think I am someone accused me of this, and I turned out to be such a blessing. Someone said to me, I know what you are, Roy Peter Clark. I said, oh, I'm found out. What is it? You are a rhetorical grammarian. And you know what? I think that's right. So I have 11 chapters in the Glamour of Grammar on punctuation, but I attend to the conventional rules accepted in different discourse communities, but I'm constantly talking about the period as a stop sign, right? In other words, when you use it, it has a certain kind of effect. White space as a form of punctuation may be the most powerful one because its visual effect kind of ventilates a page. And when you have very complicated material and you don't have enough white space on the page, your readers are screwed. And in a way you are too, because they're going to immediately perceive that dense tombstone of text to be difficult to read, even if the words themselves are not. So this is, I'm not sure, I know, I work with hundreds of designers and they all love an artist, they love white space. And they kind of taught me why I should be teaching paragraphing as a way of creating white space on the page.
So I want to get to questions if we have some from the room for Roy. I want to call you. I almost called you Dr. Clark. You never use Dr. Clark. You've got a PhD in medieval literature. You eschew the doctor label.
Not only do I eschew it, but I chew it. I thought I was very concerned when Gene Patterson hired me at the age of 29 to come to the St. Petersburg Times to be the writing coach, that those ink-stained wretches would be naturally suspicious or skeptical.
And they would be, yeah.
Of someone coming in. So anything that I could do, including wearing T-shirts during the summer in the newsroom, and some of them thought I was an intern, which was a blessing. So no, but listen, that PhD is a tool. I'll show you some documents and some texts in which it appears.
Okay.
But for a purpose.
You pulled it out on occasion.
Yes, but I leave it off as a strategically as well.
All right. So we're, if you have questions, ask in the chat, and we'll get to them. While we're still on the topic of public writing, I'm an editor. I don't do a lot of writing myself, but I certainly am edit in the way that I try to make sure things are have clarity. So is there what's your advice to people like me in the room who are perhaps public editors, if that's a legitimate term?
Yeah, you surely are. So, I have a book. One of my books, it's out of print. I hope to bring it back someday. Is called Coaching Writers. Writers and editors working together, and I would add now in the public interest. And I think Steven Pinker has a writing book out called "The Sense of Style," I think it's called.
Yeah. And
I read it, I'm happy to read a book, a writing book, any book, and get one nugget, hopefully a gold one, but I'll take a silver nugget as well. And he has one lesson that it's about why academic writing is so dense and unappealing and hard to read. And he has an excellent description for the problem. He calls it, he says, the writers, academic writers, suffer from the curse of knowledge. They forget what they didn't know when they started learning this topic, whatever it was. And at the point where they become experts, their language changes. They make certain assumptions about what people know. And so my version of that was like, I need to adapt. When I sit down and describe something, I need to adopt a strategic naivete. I have to make believe I'm learning things at the same time and the same pace as the reader. And who could do that better than an editor, right? The best editors I know, they listen to the writers. They ask questions. They'll invite the writer to read a text out loud, to ask questions like, can you give me an example of that? Or did the doctor offer you an example of that? These are the same questions that the reporter has to ask of the expert in the field. So the open-ended question, and a reflected enthusiasm for what the writer is trying to accomplish, and to look at yourselves as partners in the task, and to begin with two essential questions. What works in the text so far, and what needs more work? And look, you would be shocked, Mark, to read the third or fourth or fifth draft of this book, Tell It Like It Is. Tracy Behar's edited 7 of my books now for Little Brown, and I swear, I once thought I was a scholar. I knew I was a scholar when I came to journalism. Eventually, I wondered whether I could be a writer, and I reached a point where I thought I could. And it was not until I was in my 60s when Tracy Behar proved to me that I could call myself an author. And in a way, yeah, she sees the unrealized potential in the text and offers a kind of critique that helps me, that inspires me to fulfill that potential, rather than establishing some adversarial relationship between us.
Okay. I wanted to ask you about writing, and I think we have a question from the room along those lines, I think, also.
We do, yes. Kat, if you want to unmute and ask your question. There we go.
Sure. And in fact, I think I've seen Mr. Clark in other presentations, so I might know the answer to this, but I'd love to hear what he has to say. My question is, are you in your writing room? If so, have you done anything special to create a space that inspires you? Have you gone back to writing in coffee shops? And thank you both. Great conversation.
Thank you.
Pat, thank you for that question. I don't know exactly what you can see behind me. You know, it's a Zoom setting, which is a thing that we've learned to create, right? It's like we're little studios, and what do we want to be shown behind us to reveal our character in some particular way? This is the first book that I've written from my home. I have a 100-year-old piano behind me. I'm sitting in the place that used to be our dining room, and all my writing stuff is on the dining room table, kind of turned sideways. It's my wife's contribution to the advancement of my career at a time when I lost my familiar writing space, which was a nice little room. I wouldn't call it an office, but a cubby, if you will, in the library of the Poynter Institute, where I've worked one way or another since 1977. So in a way, I had to relearn to write a book without the infrastructure that helped me, without the same technology, without the same clerical support, people to help me, without big bulletin boards and file cabinets to create, you know, and I had to make all kinds of adjustments, and I didn't think I could do it. But I think I've learned, my goal is always to learn something new about writing every day. about the craft. Maybe it's something impossible, but for me, the pandemic just changed so many of the protocols and rituals of common life that for so many of us. And we're still, look, it changed some things permanently, like the idea of working from home, writing from home. The coffee shops, I have to say, Pat, the coffee shops were very important literary spaces, I think, in the 18th century anyway. But for me here in St. Petersburg, I love my younger millennial colleagues because they've turned St. Petersburg into St. Peter's Brew, which is to say, coffee in the morning, beer at night, and safe outdoor gathering places where you can go and meet people, have some sense of community. I write a regular column for the Tampa Bay Times, and I can't tell you how many story ideas have come about just from going down and having a latte and a blueberry muffin. So thanks for asking those questions.
So, have you written in? I mean, we talked a little bit about your writing style, and you like to have put everything on a board. Can you go into a coffee shop and write?
Yeah, but I'm zero drafting. The only thing I do in coffee shops is zero drafting. We talked about before.
Right, and I wanted to ask you about zero draft. So I had a conversation about zero draft a couple of weeks ago with Pulitzer Prize winning columnist and a United States senator. So not to name drop, but I'll drop those names. And there was and I was explaining the concept of zero draft, which you said isn't original to you, but it's but I think it's a great way to look at how to get started in writing. So what is a zero draft?
So I try not to, there's a great book on writing that many writers know about called Bird by Bird by Anne. It's an excellent book with excellent lessons. There's something that she does, however, that I want to be respectful. Kind of rubs me the wrong way.
Okay.
And that is that for such an accomplished writer, there's so much self-loathing in some of the language she uses to describe her own work before it's finished and polished. She talks about shitty first drafts, for example. It's just an example that comes to mind. There's somebody that refers to a famous writer that talks about vomit drafting. So, oh, come on, give me a break. It's hard enough. Give me something easier. And so I guess Peter Drucker wrote this description of writing process that Donald Murray passed on to me, that is called zero drafting. And that just comes before the first draft. So it gets you to that point that William Stafford, the poet, talks about, where the easiest way to overcome writer's block is to lower your standards. When I tell that to young writers, to high school writers, it says, I'm the only teacher who's going to tell you to lower your standards. Your education is to try to get you to raise your standards. But at the beginning of the process, you have to sometimes let your hands do the thinking. And the other part of zero drafting is writing earlier than you think you can. So by that I mean going out and doing an interview or reading something. And I know lots of people who, investigative reporters and PhD students, say, well, I'm not ready to write yet because I haven't finished the research. But for me, what I like to do is to get stuff, put it aside, right? And then write without reference to the notes. Sometimes typing quickly, sometimes list making on yellow pads at the coffee shop. Two effects of zero drafting. One, it teaches me what I know. And then it teaches me what I still have to learn. And in doing so, it really helps me focus the research or report. So, yeah, I pass it along hoping that it helps others. The other thing, the other part of this, there was another Donald in New Hampshire with Donald Murray named Donald Graves, and he was a famous elementary school teacher, and wrote about children, how children read and write. And he would see a lot of kids, including first and second graders, not being, quote, on task, but looking up into the air, daydreaming. And when he did his research and interviewed these kids, it turned out that some of them, not all of them, were actually writing. They were rehearsing in the way all of us do. So rehearsing is the antidote to procrastination. You know, I delivered a commencement speech at Providence College in 2017. And I got the assignment 3 months ahead of time. And I didn't put a word on paper or on the screen till about 3 weeks before the speech. But I can tell you that at night, staring at the ceiling, walking around the block, driving to work, I was rehearsing that 15-minute speech. And when I sat down to write it, I wrote almost without stopping 8,000 words for a text that was going to wind up being about 1,800 words. So these are two strategies. Lower your standards, or make believe you're going to ask somebody out on a date. You're not just going to blurt it out. You're going to work it over in your head before you deliver it.
Okay. And it occurs to me a couple of these are the zero draft, the idea of rehearsing. I believe was in that. There's just a great Twitter stream, and I don't remember if you wrote it up for Poynter, but I remember reading it all written up. Your list of bits of advice. I think there were 23 or so. Somebody in England wrote to you and said, "Hey, help me out. Tell me what are some of the points in your book that I should be interested in?"
Yeah, he wrote. He not only sent me a letter with that request, he had created a little booklet with 32 pages. And I decided in about an hour or so, without reference to my notes or any of my books, like, can I think of 32 things that I can give him? The first one is, the first page, I think it said, writing isn't magic. It's a process, a set of steps you can learn. The second one was something like, it was Don Murray, a page a day equals a book a year. Someone said, people will say to me, how do you write my productivity? How do you write, publish like 8 books in 15 years or whatever? I said, well, the first thing I do is I write during faculty meetings and make believe I'm taking notes and do some sort of zero drafting there. But the second thing is it's the bird by bird lesson. It's to break up the big thing, 362 pages into a page a day. I say I can run a marathon. Mark, I can run a marathon. I swear I can. If you give me 52 days. I can do that half mile every day.
All right.
Walking fast, not no more running.
We're running out of time. I wanted to ask about, and I will ask, we might as well take a couple of minutes here, but really quick, you've been writing a column now for the Tampa Bay Times, formerly the St. Petersburg Times. Is that your first stint at sort of regular writing? And it's eclectic. It's all over the place. You're doing different things. What's that been like for the past however long, year?
It's been I was a privileged freelancer for the Times for many years, and they were very generous. I wrote a 29-part series on AIDS called Three Little Words 25 years ago. So, but there was something about, I don't know, there was something about the pandemic and all of the other sort of news and for, I don't know, a reminder of simple ideas, moments of light, bits of humor. A word that I like is whimsical. The Times publishes in print, in paper, on Wednesdays and Sundays. And I have to say that I just turned 75, so I'm a glorious baby boomer. And I have a feeling that many of my readers, not all my readers, but many of my readers are people who still like to hold paper in their hand when they read. And so, in a way, I'm a baby boomer whisperer. I write about the Beatles. Look at me. I'm wearing my Beatles hat, for God's sake. I write about Star Wars. I write about James Bond. I'm writing I'm writing a column, hasn't been published yet, on the blind date and my personal history, good and not so good. And so the gratitude of readers has been so interesting and so inspiring. The news is freaking hard to experience these days. Maybe anytime, it's so hard. There's testimony from veteran journalists who say they can't watch it anymore. So Dave Barry, the great humorist, gave me encouragement to follow through on this and to write things. So at a time during our quarantine, for the first time, I spent a significant period of time sitting on my front porch, looking at the giant oak tree that my wife planted years ago, and studying the bird life. And in Florida, we have wonderful bird life, insane. My God, I don't want the pandemic for anybody, but it's got me in this chair, and suddenly I love pelicans, and I'm reciting. You know the pelican poem?
Oh yeah. I do. No, tell us the pelican poem, please.
Written by Dixon Merritt. a newspaper columnist from Tennessee and an amateur ornithologist about 100 years ago. A wonderful bird is the pelican. His bill will hold more than his bellican. Now, everybody thinks that that poem was written by Ogden Nash, but it wasn't. Everybody thinks it's a couplet, but it isn't. It's a limerick. A wonderful bird is the pelican. His bill will hold more than his bellican. He can keep in his beak food enough for a week, but I'm damned if I see how the hell he can. I turned that, by the way, into a song with that as a lyric, but I added a chorus, if I may. I won't play. You may not be able to hear the keyboard, so I'm just going to do it a cappella.
Okay.
All right. All right, we'll do the original. The wonderful bird is the pelican. His bill will hold more than his bellican. His beak food enough for a week, but I'm damned if I see how the hell he can. Jimmy Buffett's little One day I looked up at the deep blue sky. A squadron of birds, they were flying high. And oops, just like that, they all pooped on my hat. I consider myself quite a lucky guy. So I published a song. I went to city council in St. Petersburg. And I said, it's time, ladies and gentlemen, for the city of St. Petersburg to declare the brown pelican, not the white pelican, the brown pelican is the official bird of the city. And sure enough, just before the quarantine kicked in, it was a done deal. It shows what poetry and music can do in a city council meeting. Well, that kind of, I don't mean to be like Ted Lasso, although I love Ted Lasso, but just more and more moments of spirit, moments of hope, moments of kindness expressed in your human character and affect, but also in your words, seems more important than ever.
All right. Well, thank you so much. It's been wonderful. I could spend another hour, and maybe we will write another book, and we'll come back and we'll do it again.
No more books.
Yeah.
No more books.
You're at 20, but 21's a round number too. I mean, 21 has some luck to it, right? So thank you very much, everybody, for sticking around. Thank you very much, Roy Peter Clark. It's been great to see you. Look forward to seeing you again sometime soon. And we'll be back in a month with a medievalist, another medievalist. We have many guests who are medievalists. And I don't know how to pronounce her name because I've always written it, but I think it's Judith Chan, Tshannn, Tshann. I never met her, but I'm looking forward to it. But she has written a new book recently out, Romaine Wasn't Built in a Day, The Delightful History of Food Language. So we'll have her next month. So
I've read it, Mark, and it's excellent. Yes.
Excellent. Wonderful. All right. Thanks so much. Take care, everybody.